It was a warm Saturday afternoon when I decided to fire up the grill in my backyard, not expecting that a simple barbecue would turn into something far more complicated. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood, and the scent of sizzling burgers quickly wafted into the air. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, a quiet retreat from the bustle of work and life. But as I flipped the burgers, I noticed something unusual, something that immediately made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A woman, mid-40s, in a wide-brimmed sunhat, was staring at me from her yard next door. I had seen her before, but I had never spoken to her. She seemed different. The look on her face wasn't the typical neighborly curiosity. It was judgment, sharp and pointed. She didn't wave or even acknowledge my presence. Instead, she stood there, arms crossed, watching every movement I made. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. Something wasn't right. Minutes passed, but she didn't move, didn't even look away. It felt as though she was waiting for something, or maybe someone. I went about my grilling, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't subside. I turned my attention back to the grill, hoping to get lost in the task. The sound of sizzling meat was comforting, but it was as if I could feel her eyes on the back of my head. That's when it happened. I heard the unmistakable sound of a siren, faint at first, but getting louder. My stomach tightened, and I looked up, scanning the street. Sure enough, I saw the flashing lights of a fire truck turning into my neighborhood. I froze for a moment, confused. The sirens were heading in my direction. Were they coming to my house? I quickly dismissed the thought, thinking it was some kind of mistake. But as the truck came to a halt in front of my house, the uneasy feeling returned with full force. I stood there, dumbfounded, watching as two firefighters climbed out, looking at each other with perplexed expressions. One of them glanced at me, then at the neighbor who had been watching me earlier. And that's when I knew, she had called them. She had somehow convinced the fire department that I was causing a danger. My peaceful barbecue was suddenly under suspicion, and I was about to be thrust into an absurd nightmare that would change everything. The firefighters stood by their truck, unsure of what they were supposed to do. They exchanged glances, clearly questioning the situation. I was still frozen in place, not sure if I should approach them or just stay out of their way. The neighbor, who had been watching me with what seemed like cold determination, finally walked over to the firefighters. Her steps were deliberate, and I could almost feel the tension in the air thickening. She had a slight smile on her face, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and as she spoke to them, I realized she was putting on an act, a performance designed to make me look like some kind of menace. Her words were deliberate, but laced with a kind of practiced concern that made my blood run cold. She was telling them that I was grilling without proper safety measures, that the smoke was potentially dangerous, and that she had seen me handling the grill in ways that could cause a fire. The more she spoke, the more absurd her accusation seemed, but it didn't matter. She was making sure they were listening, ensuring that the narrative she was spinning was taking hold. The firefighters nodded along, their faces stiff with professionalism, but it was clear they weren't entirely convinced by her claims. Yet, they had a job to do, and I couldn't help but feel that this was going to escalate into something far beyond a simple misunderstanding. I stood there, watching the scene unfold before me, my heart racing with the dawning realization that I was caught in something much bigger than I had anticipated. I tried to call out to them, to explain that this was just a simple backyard barbecue, that there was no danger, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about the way they looked at me, as if they were already half convinced of her story. She was, after all, the one who had brought them here. The one who had made sure they thought I was a threat. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I protest? Should I invite them in to see the grill, to prove that it was nothing more than a harmless family gathering? Or should I just stand there, waiting for them to do whatever they were going to do? The choice felt like it had already been made for me. The firefighter who had been silent up until this point walked toward the grill, his steps purposeful. He didn't ask if he could take a look, he simply reached for the tongs, lifting the lid off the grill. The smell of sizzling burgers wafted into the air, but to my surprise, he didn't seem concerned about the safety of the cooking process. Instead, he just nodded, seemingly satisfied that there was no immediate danger. But that didn't seem to change anything. The other firefighter, who had been watching the exchange with a skeptical expression, turned to me and asked if I had a permit for grilling. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. A permit? What on earth were they talking about? I wasn't in some apartment complex or a crowded city where permits might make sense. This was my own backyard, and I had been grilling in this very spot for years without incident. Yet, their tone was serious. They were following procedure, no matter how outlandish the situation seemed. As the conversation dragged on, I realized that this wasn't just about grilling anymore. This had become a battle of wills, a contest between me and the woman next door who had somehow managed to drag these professionals into a petty conflict. I couldn't let this go on. I had to make them see reason, to convince them that I wasn't the dangerous person she was portraying me to be. But how could I? How could I prove that this was all a mistake, that my peaceful barbecue had become a battleground for someone's misplaced vendetta? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. There was a chance I could still turn this around, but it required something more than just logic or reason. It required me to stand my ground, to refuse to let her narrative take root any further. I began explaining, calmly but firmly, that this was my private property, and I had every right to grill in my own backyard. I told them about how I'd lived here for years without issue, that I had never caused any problems with the neighbors before, and that I certainly wasn't about to start now. I wasn't trying to be confrontational, but I needed to make it clear that this wasn't some isolated incident. The more I spoke, the more I could see the doubt creeping into their faces. But it wasn't enough. The neighbor stood there, arms crossed, her smile now gone, replaced with a look of determination. She wasn't going to back down. I could feel the weight of her presence bearing down on me, her quiet insistence hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. She was trying to control the narrative, to make me seem like the unreasonable one. But as the conversation dragged on, something changed. The tension in the air shifted. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about my grilling or her accusations. There was a subtle but undeniable shift, one that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The firefighters were starting to listen to me. They were starting to see that this was a baseless claim, that I wasn't some reckless menace. One of them, the one who had seemed most skeptical, spoke up. He told me that while he understood the safety concerns, they had no reason to stay if everything seemed in order. The other firefighter nodded, clearly agreeing, and the two of them began to move toward their truck, as if they were ready to leave. But before they could get too far, the woman spoke again. Her voice was sharp, desperate. She insisted that they couldn't leave until they'd taken care of the situation, that I was a threat to the neighborhood and that something had to be done. But this time, there was something different in her tone, something almost panicked. The firefighters exchanged a look, but it was clear they weren't buying it anymore. The woman's authority was slipping, and I could see that the tide was turning. I felt a small sense of triumph, but it was fleeting. The battle wasn't over yet. The firefighters turned back to me, and for the first time, they seemed to question whether she had the right to make these claims. But they had to go through the motions. They had to make sure they weren't missing something, even though it was becoming obvious that this was nothing more than an attempt to stir up trouble. And as they prepared to leave, I could see her frustration mounting. She was losing control, and she didn't know how to react. Her eyes darted between the firefighters and me, and in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. This was about power, about control, about someone trying to dictate how I lived my life. And I wasn't going to let her win. As the firefighters finally drove off, I watched them leave, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering tension. The situation wasn't over, not by a long shot. I could feel the neighbor's presence like an oppressive weight still hanging in the air. She hadn't given up, I knew that much. As I stood in my backyard, the scent of grilled meat still in the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. She had made her move, and though I had managed to get the firefighters to leave, the battle had just begun. There was something unsettling about the way she had acted, something that made me realize she wasn't just concerned about a harmless barbecue. There was an underlying force at work, and I was caught right in the middle of it. I spent the next few hours cleaning up, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. What was her real motive? Why was she so determined to make something so trivial into a major issue? I couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of her attempt to take control of the neighborhood, to impose her rules on everyone around her. I had seen her before, but never really paid attention. She had always seemed like just another neighbor, someone who stuck to herself. But now, I was starting to think that there was more to her than met the eye. By the time evening came, I had managed to calm down somewhat, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if she was lurking just beyond my line of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The quiet of the night seemed almost suffocating, like the calm before the storm. As I sat on my porch, sipping a drink and trying to unwind, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A figure moving in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned my head sharply, only to find the woman from next door standing at the edge of her yard, watching me again. She was silent, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. This time, though, there was something different in her gaze, a cold determination that I hadn't seen before. She wasn't just watching, she was waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. But I had a feeling it wasn't going to be good. I tried to shake off the unease, but it was impossible. I had just faced down a small army of firefighters, but now, it felt like I was being stalked by a far more dangerous enemy. The next day, I woke up to find that the unease hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only grown stronger. I didn't want to be paranoid, but it was becoming clear that I was caught in a web of some kind of power play. Every time I went outside, I could feel her eyes on me, and every time I looked over, she was there, standing at the edge of her yard, watching from a distance. It was as if she was studying me, trying to find a weakness. And that was when I realized just how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. I decided I wasn't going to be intimidated. This was my home, my space, and I wasn't going to let anyone, especially her, make me feel like I didn't belong here. I started paying closer attention to what was going on around me. I made sure to keep an eye out for any signs of her trying to escalate things further. It wasn't long before I started noticing little things, strange things, that only confirmed my suspicions. One afternoon, as I was leaving to run some errands, I saw her standing at her fence, talking to someone on her phone. She wasn't speaking loudly, but I could make out a few words, enough to make my blood run cold. She was talking about me, about my property, about how I was a danger to the neighborhood. Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a calculated tone that made it clear she was laying the groundwork for something much bigger than just a complaint about grilling. I couldn't hear everything she said, but the words I did catch were enough to make me realize that she was organizing something, a campaign to rally the neighbors against me. It wasn't just about grilling anymore. It wasn't even just about her overstepping her boundaries. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me, to paint me as a troublemaker, a threat to the peace and safety of the community. And as much as I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't ignore the fact that it was working. Neighbors who had once waved and smiled when we passed on the street were now avoiding me, crossing the road to avoid a conversation. I started hearing whispers, muffled conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. I wasn't just the guy who grilled in his backyard anymore. I was the guy who was causing problems, the guy who didn't follow the rules. It was happening quickly, like a snowball gathering speed as it rolled downhill. The final straw came one morning when I found a letter in my mailbox. It was an anonymous note, typed, with a single line that sent chills down my spine: "You're not welcome here." No signature, no return address. Just those 5 words, written in a way that made it clear this wasn't just a random complaint. Someone had gone out of their way to ensure that I saw it, that I understood what they were trying to say. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the letter in disbelief. The neighbor, it seemed, had succeeded. She had gotten to the people who lived around me, and now they were all too eager to make me feel unwelcome. It was clear that things had gone too far. The battle had shifted from the trivialities of grilling to something much darker. It was no longer just about her trying to control my actions. It was about her trying to destroy my peace of mind. The question now was how far I was willing to go to fight back. How much was I willing to risk to protect my home, my place of refuge? I knew the answer already, but the road ahead would be difficult, and I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what was coming next. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going to back down. The following days were a blur, a whirlwind of unsettling encounters and growing tension. The letter was just the beginning. It seemed as though the entire neighborhood had turned its back on me, fueled by whispers and rumors that I could never fully escape. The neighbors' influence had spread like wildfire, and the quiet, peaceful existence I had once enjoyed in my home was slipping through my fingers. As I walked down the street, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me, their gazes cold and judgmental, like I was a stranger in my own neighborhood. Every smile, every casual nod that had once been exchanged with ease had vanished, replaced by awkward silences or hurried glances away. The worst part was that no one would tell me what was really going on. No one would confront me directly. They had all been swept up in the hysteria she had created, and I was left to wonder just how much damage had been done. I started to hear things. Indirect comments made in passing, hushed voices as people spoke behind my back, gossip spreading through the neighborhood like an infectious disease. The worst part was that no one ever came to me, no one tried to understand my side of the story. I was labeled, branded as a troublemaker, someone who didn't belong. The once friendly faces that had greeted me with warmth now looked at me with distrust. But it wasn't just the neighbors. The whole atmosphere around me had changed. Even the local businesses, the ones I had frequented regularly, started treating me differently. I noticed the subtle changes in their behavior. The cashier at the corner store no longer smiled when I walked in. The barista at the coffee shop no longer asked how my day was going. It was as if I had become invisible, a pariah in my own community. I couldn't even go for a simple walk without feeling like the walls were closing in around me. The whispers seemed to follow me, drifting on the wind, making me feel suffocated. I had no way to escape it. The tension finally reached its breaking point when I noticed a group of people gathered in front of my house one afternoon. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, a few neighbors chatting, but as I got closer, I saw that the group was talking about me. They were discussing the problem I had caused, the dangerous grilling, the supposed disregard for the neighborhood's rules. They didn't see a neighbor who had simply wanted to enjoy a quiet afternoon. They saw a threat, someone who didn't respect the established order, someone who needed to be dealt with. The neighbor was there too, standing at the front of the group, nodding along, feeding the fire with every word. It was clear now that this wasn't just about grilling anymore. It was about power. She was trying to take control, and she was using the entire neighborhood as her battleground. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the murmurs, the accusations, and the lies that were being spread about me. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I kept it in check. There was nothing to be gained by confronting them now. But as I watched them disperse, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her and the people she had manipulated destroy everything I had worked so hard for. The next move had to be mine, and I had to be smart about it. I couldn't rely on the law to protect me, not with the way things had escalated. I had to find a way to turn the tide, to make them see the truth before it was too late. I started reaching out to others who had lived here long enough to remember a time before the neighbor had gained so much influence. I knew it wasn't just the recent complaints that had caused the shift in the community, it was her influence, her ability to manipulate and control the narrative. I couldn't take her on alone, not when she had the entire neighborhood in her corner. But if I could rally the ones who had seen through her facade, maybe I could turn things around. It wouldn't be easy. She had already made sure that anyone who spoke out against her was labeled a troublemaker, but I was willing to risk it. It was the only way I could fight back. Days passed as I quietly reached out to the people who might be willing to stand by me, the ones who hadn't fallen for her lies. It was slow going at first, and the fear was palpable. People were scared to speak out, scared of the retribution they might face. But slowly, one by one, a few started to come forward. They told me that they had seen the way she operated, the way she manipulated people, turning small grievances into personal crusades. They remembered when she first moved into the neighborhood, how she had quickly wormed her way into positions of influence, using her charm and manipulation to win people over. They had seen through her then, but most had been too afraid to speak up. It became clear that I wasn't the only one who had been affected by her, and the more I listened, the more I realized how deeply her influence had spread. The people who had once been allies had now turned against each other, all of them swept up in her power play. But even so, there was hope. There was a chance that, together, we could stop her before she went too far. I knew that I had to act quickly. The next step was to confront her, to expose her for what she truly was. It wouldn't be easy, and it might cost me the little peace I had left in the neighborhood, but I couldn't let her continue unchecked. The stakes had become much higher than just a simple backyard barbecue. This was about standing up for my rights, for my place in this community. I wasn't going to let her control my life, my neighborhood, any longer. The night before I planned to confront the neighbor, I couldn't sleep. The weight of what was about to happen kept me up, tossing and turning in bed, my mind running through all the possibilities. Tomorrow would be the day I either took back control of my life or lost everything I had worked for. The reality of it all was heavy, and I knew that whatever came next, it was going to be difficult. But I had no choice anymore. I couldn't let her tear apart my place of peace just because she wanted to play God in our neighborhood. She had crossed a line, and I was done being passive. I had spoken to a handful of neighbors, the ones who still had a sense of decency, and they were ready to support me. We didn't have to win them all over, but we needed a few voices of reason to stand together against her. The ones I had spoken to all had stories of her manipulation, her relentless pursuit of control over every little aspect of our lives. And now, we were ready to do something about it. The next morning, I made my way to her house. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my focus. I couldn't let her see my nerves, not now, not when everything was on the line. As I approached her front door, I could hear her inside, her voice carrying through the walls, just as I had heard her speaking before, plotting and scheming. I could feel my blood boiling as I stood there, but I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. When she answered, her smile was almost too sweet, too practiced, and it made me sick. I knew she wasn't expecting me. She had probably thought that after all the drama, I would back off, that I would cave to the pressure. But she was wrong. This time, I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. I wasn't going to let her pretend she was the righteous one. I stood my ground, letting her hear my frustration, my determination. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could bully an entire neighborhood into submission. She seemed taken aback by my sudden presence, but she quickly regained her composure, her eyes narrowing as she sized me up. She hadn't expected me to come here with so much resolve, with so much anger. But I didn't care about her reaction. I wasn't there to negotiate or beg for forgiveness. I was there to set the record straight. I explained, as calmly as I could, that I wasn't going to tolerate her harassment anymore, that I had already spoken to enough people to know I wasn't alone in this. The weight of the truth seemed to settle in the air between us, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. I could see the frustration in her eyes, the realization that her web of lies was beginning to unravel. She tried to keep her composure, but it was clear that her usual tactics weren't working this time. The neighborhood wasn't buying into her version of events anymore. People were starting to see her for what she truly was, a bully who had used her influence to manipulate others. And I wasn't the only one who was done with it. But instead of backing down, she did what she always did, she tried to make me the problem. She painted herself as the victim, the one who had simply wanted peace and safety for the neighborhood, while I was the one stirring up trouble. It was the same tired routine, and I wasn't buying it anymore. I knew what she was doing, and I wasn't going to fall for it. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about showing the rest of the neighborhood that they didn't have to live in fear of her, that they didn't have to let her control them. As I turned to leave, feeling like I had at least made my point, I could hear her muttering behind me, her words dripping with venom. But I didn't look back. I had done what I needed to do. The next part of the plan was already in motion. My group of supporters was ready to take a stand, and I was confident that together, we could start to shift the balance of power. But even with that confidence, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The neighbor wasn't going to give up. She would fight tooth and nail to maintain her hold over the neighborhood. But I was prepared for whatever came next. The moment I left her house, I felt a surge of adrenaline. It wasn't over, but it was a turning point. I had stood up to her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control again. But there was no time to waste. The support I had gathered had to come together now, before she could regroup and find a way to regain her influence. The next few days were a blur of organizing and coordinating with the others who had agreed to stand with me. We didn't need a huge crowd. We didn't need to be loud. We just needed to make sure that the truth was heard. The plan was simple but effective. We were going to meet with the HOA board, the people who had let her run rampant with her claims, and show them that the narrative she had built was nothing more than a house of cards. We weren't going to make threats or demands. We were going to present the facts. The meeting was scheduled, and as the day drew closer, the tension mounted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming, something that would test me in ways I hadn't prepared for. But I was ready. I had to be. I had already lost too much to back down now. The day of the HOA meeting finally arrived, and as I stood in front of the building, my heart raced. It was strange, this feeling of nervous anticipation. I had spent so much time fighting for control, organizing with the neighbors who had seen through the lies, that I hadn't really considered how it would all unfold. Now, standing there, knowing that today could change everything, it felt surreal. The weight of the situation was undeniable. The neighbor had been working behind the scenes to rally support, to twist the narrative, and to paint me as the villain. She wasn't just trying to stop me from grilling, she was trying to ruin my reputation, my place in the neighborhood. But now, as I walked into that meeting room, I was no longer just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the people who had been manipulated by her, for those who had been too afraid to speak up. This wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about standing up against someone who thought she could control everything around her. The room was filled with familiar faces, but they weren't the same as before. People who had once been cordial, who had waved at me from across the street, now looked at me with cautious eyes. It was clear they were all trying to make sense of what had been happening, but they were also terrified. The neighbor's influence had infected everything. Her whispers had turned simple misunderstandings into deep divides. As I took a seat, I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, for someone to make the first move. It was a strange mix of anticipation and dread, and I knew that it wasn't just me who was anxious. They were all wondering what would happen next. Would they take my side, or would they side with her and continue to let her control the narrative? I could feel the eyes of the board members on me as I sat down, and I knew they were already making judgments, trying to figure out who was in the right. I wasn't sure what they had heard about me, or what they had been told, but I had a feeling it wasn't pretty. The neighbor had spun her story in a way that made me look like a reckless, dangerous person. But I knew the truth, and that's what I was going to bring to the table. I wasn't going to let her turn me into a villain. As the meeting began, I could see her sitting in the back, her posture rigid with the same sense of superiority that had become all too familiar. She wasn't even trying to hide it now, she was ready for the fight, prepared to stand her ground and continue to push her narrative. But what she didn't know was that things were different now. The board members didn't seem as certain as they once were. Some of them looked at her with the same wariness I had seen in others. It was subtle, but it was there. The tide was beginning to shift. People were starting to question the story she had fed them, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a chance. I waited my turn, letting the meeting unfold as it would, but I could already tell the room was growing restless. The neighbors who had gathered were starting to speak up, sharing their own experiences of how they had been manipulated, how they had been intimidated into silence. One by one, they stood and told their stories, stories of how she had twisted their words, how she had turned small complaints into personal crusades. And as each person spoke, I could see the walls around her beginning to crack. It was no longer just me against her. It was all of us, standing together. When my turn came, I stood and looked around the room. I could see the looks of curiosity, of uncertainty, in the faces of those who had once sided with her. They were no longer so sure. I spoke calmly but firmly, explaining the situation as it really was. I told them about the grilling incident, about how it had spiraled out of control because of one person's vendetta. I talked about the letters, the lies, and the way I had been treated like an outsider in my own neighborhood. I didn't make threats. I didn't raise my voice. I just laid out the facts. The truth was powerful, and I could feel it in the room as I spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes moving between me and the neighbor, who was now sitting with her arms tightly crossed, her face flushed with frustration. As the meeting continued, it became clear that the neighbor's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. The board members began to ask her questions, but they weren't the questions she was expecting. They weren't buying her story anymore. For the first time, she was forced to defend herself without the power of manipulation, without the influence she had so carefully crafted. The mask she had worn so well was slipping, and it was becoming impossible for her to hide behind her carefully constructed facade. By the end of the meeting, the board had made a decision. The neighbor was no longer the president of the HOA. The vote had been unanimous. She had lost. It was over. The crowd that had gathered in the room stood, some with hesitant applause, others with a sense of relief. The power had shifted, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The battle had been long, and it had been difficult, but we had won. The neighbor, her influence shattered, stood up and stormed out of the room, her face twisted in anger. She wasn't done yet, I knew, but she had lost her strongest weapon. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to change. People who had once been afraid to speak out against her now felt free to breathe, to be themselves again. The petty rules that had once governed our lives started to fade away, replaced by a sense of community that had been missing for so long. The new president of the HOA, a reasonable man who had no interest in playing games, began working with the residents, not against them. The petty fines disappeared, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift from one of fear and control to one of cooperation and mutual respect. The neighbor who had tried to tear everything down was gone, and with her, the dark cloud that had hung over the neighborhood lifted. I had fought for my home, for my place in the community, and I had won. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over the quiet streets, I realized that, in the end, it wasn't just about the barbecue. It was about standing up for what's right, for what's fair, and for the freedom to live our lives without fear of being controlled by someone else. And that, more than anything, was the victory I had been fighting for all along.